There is a line in one of the most celebrated American novels of the 20th century. Readers have loved it for 100 years. The woman who actually wrote those words never got her name on the page. Her name was Zelda. And this is the part no one tells. To understand what was lost, you have to start in a place that no longer exists the way it once did. Montgomery, Alabama, at the very beginning of the 20th century. A southern city still living half inside the memory of a war it had lost, slow and hot and bound by manners, where the right family name opened every door worth opening. And into that world, on the 24th of July, 1900, a girl was born who would spend her whole life refusing to fit inside it. Her name was Zelda Sayre, and the name itself tells you something. Her mother, Minnie, had taken it from a novel, from a story about a gypsy queen, and she gave it to her youngest child, the way you might hand someone a costume they would have to grow into. Zelda was the baby of the family, the last of 6, several years younger than her nearest sister. By the time she arrived, her parents were older, her siblings nearly grown, and so she occupied a strange position in that household. Adored, indulged, and in some quiet way alone. Her father was Anthony Dickinson Sayre, and he was not a man given to softness. He sat as a judge, eventually rising to the Alabama Supreme Court, and he carried the bench home with him. He was austere, disciplined, deeply respectable, the kind of man whose approval you sensed you would never quite earn. And against that cool and rigid presence stood her mother, Minnie, who poured into Zelda everything her husband withheld. She called her baby. She let her run. She wrote little poems for her and dressed her in beautiful clothes and treated her, from the very start, as something rare. You can see the whole shape of Zelda's character in that one fact. A father who represented order, and a mother who represented permission. And a daughter caught between them who decided, very early, that permission was the more interesting of the two. Because Zelda was, by every account that survives, electric. Not pretty in the demure way that Montgomery prized in its daughters, but striking, golden-haired, athletic, with a quality people kept reaching for words to describe, and never quite catching. She danced. From the time she was small, she took ballet seriously, and she was good enough that it mattered to her in a way that almost nothing else did. She dove off high boards. She swam hard. She moved through the physical world with a confidence that girls of her time and place were not supposed to have, and certainly were not supposed to enjoy so openly. And she enjoyed it openly. That was the thing about her. She did not hide. By the time she reached high school, she had become a kind of local legend, which in a town the size of Montgomery is a particular and dangerous thing to be. The stories accumulated. That she smoked, that she drank, that she danced too close to the boys, and stayed out too late, and once wore a flesh-colored bathing suit specifically so that people would whisper she had gone swimming with nothing on. Whether every story was true matters less than the fact that she wanted them told. She understood, even as a teenager, that there was a kind of power in being talked about, that a reputation could be a form of authorship. You write the legend yourself, or someone else writes it for you. In her high school yearbook, beneath her photograph, ran a line that read almost like a manifesto. "Why should all life be work?" it asked, "when we all can borrow? Let's only live today, and not worry over tomorrow." It is the sort of thing that sounds charming when a 17-year-old says it. It sounds like something else entirely when you know how the rest of the story goes. But here is what gets lost when people tell this part. It is easy to file Zelda away as the wild girl, the belle, the beauty who broke hearts at the country club. That was the version Montgomery understood. And it was the version that would follow her for the rest of her life and long past it. But underneath the performance was a mind that was genuinely original. She wrote, she painted. She had opinions about everything, and the nerve to voice them, which in a young woman of that era read as either delightful or appalling depending on who was watching. She was not simply decorative. She was a maker of things, restless and inventive, with an imagination that had nowhere obvious to go. And that is the quiet tragedy hiding in plain sight at the start of all this. Because Montgomery, Alabama, in 1917 had no idea what to do with a girl like that. There was no path for her. A young woman of her class was meant to be admired, courted and married well, and then to disappear gracefully into a household. Her talent, whatever it was treated as charm. Her ambition, such as it was, had no language and no destination. So she did what brilliant, restless people with no outlet often do. She made herself into the most exciting person in the room. She turned her whole self into the work of art, because no one had offered her any other canvas. And then, in the summer of 1918, into a country club dance on the outskirts of that small southern city, walked a young lieutenant from Minnesota. He was 21 years old. He thought he was going to be a great writer. And the moment he saw her, his entire life rearranged itself around the fact of her existence. That is where the empire begins. The dance was held at the Montgomery Country Club in July of 1918. The war was still on, and the city was full of young officers from the training camp nearby, Camp Sheridan, where the army was preparing men to be shipped to France. They came into town in their uniforms looking for something to do with their last free evenings, and Montgomery, which had very little to offer the world in those years, offered them its daughters at the country club. Zelda was 17. She was by then the most sought-after girl in the city, and she was dancing. The young man watching her was Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald. He was 21 years old, a lieutenant from St. Paul, Minnesota, who had washed out of Princeton without a degree and joined the army convinced he was about to die in the war, and equally convinced that before he did, he was going to write something that would outlive him. He had already written a novel. It had already been rejected. He carried the certainty of his own greatness around with him the way some men carry a wound, and most of the people who met him found it either thrilling or insufferable. When he saw Zelda, the certainty found its subject. What happened between them over the following months was not a quiet courtship. It was a collision. They were, in a sense, the same person wearing two different costumes. Both of them hungry for attention and gifted at getting it. Both of them performers. Both of them convinced that ordinary life was a kind of insult, and that they were meant for something larger and brighter. He fell completely. She enjoyed being fallen for, which is not the same thing, and for a long while she kept him at the precise distance that kept him desperate. The war ended in November of that year, before he ever reached France, and with the war went the romantic death he had half been counting on. So now there was just the rest of his life to deal with, and the girl in Montgomery, and the small inconvenient fact that he had no money and no prospects and nothing to offer a judge's daughter except his enormous and unproven faith in himself. He went to New York. He took a job writing advertising copy, which he hated, and he tried to make enough money to convince Zelda that a future with him was not a mistake. He wrote her constantly. And here is the detail that matters, the one that quietly sets the terms of everything that comes after. He did not just write to her. He wrote her down. He kept her letters. He copied passages from them. He took the way she talked, the bright, slangy, original way she had of putting things, and he began to save it, the way a man saves material. Because that is what it was to him. She was a person he loved. She was also, from very early on, a source. In the summer of 1919, she broke off the engagement. The reason was money, or at least money, was the language the refusal was conducted in. She was not going to gamble her life on a man who could not yet support her, and she told him so, and he came apart. He quit the job. He went home to St. Paul, moved back into his parents' house, and shut himself in a room on the third floor to rewrite the novel that had already been rejected once. He had everything writing on it now. The girl. The future. The whole image of the man he intended to be. He called it This Side of Paradise. Scribners accepted it in the autumn of 1919, and on the 26th of March 1920, it was published. The book did not simply succeed, it detonated. It made Fitzgerald famous almost overnight. The voice of a new generation, the young man who had captured something nobody else had managed to name yet. He was 23 years old, and suddenly everyone wanted to know him. 1 week later, on the 3rd of April 1920, he and Zelda were married in the rectory of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. She was 19. The ceremony was small and quick, almost an afterthought, because the real event, the one the world cared about, had already happened on the page. And that is the part worth sitting with. Because the book that won her, the book that made him, was already full of her. The heroine, Rosalind, was drawn from Zelda so directly that people who knew them recognized it at once. The novel was, in part, a portrait of the very courtship that the novel's success had just made possible. He had taken the girl, turned her into a character, sold the character to the public, and used the proceeds to claim the girl. There is a circularity to that which is almost too neat to be true, and yet it is exactly what happened. Neither of them seemed troubled by it then. Why would they be? They were young and in love and standing at the edge of a decade that would belong to them more than to almost anyone. They had no way of knowing that the arrangement made in those first months, the unspoken agreement about whose life would become the material and whose would do the writing, was not a passing convenience. It was the foundation, and everything that rose afterward would rest on it. She thought she was marrying a partner. In a way she was. But it was not the kind of partnership where the credit gets shared. In 1922, the New York Tribune ran a review of Scott Fitzgerald's second novel, The Beautiful and Damned. The review was sharp, funny, a little mischievous, and it was written by Zelda. The newspaper had asked her to do it precisely because of the novelty of the thing, the famous young author's beautiful young wife turning critic. It was meant as a lark. What she actually delivered was something closer to a confession disguised as a joke. Because in the course of reviewing her husband's book, Zelda noted lightly, almost in passing, that she had recognized parts of it. She wrote that on one page she seemed to find a portion of an old diary of hers that had mysteriously disappeared shortly after the wedding, and scraps of her letters, edited a little but unmistakable. And then she delivered the line that has followed the marriage ever since. Mr. Fitzgerald, she wrote, seems to believe that plagiarism begins at home. She said it as a joke. That is the thing to hold on to. She framed it as teasing, as the kind of barb a clever wife throws at a clever husband in public for the entertainment of both. But a joke is often the only acceptable way to say a true thing out loud, and the true thing underneath it was this. The words in the best-selling novel were, in places, her words, lifted from her diary, drawn from her letters. The voice that critics were praising as Scott Fitzgerald's gift for capturing the modern woman was, in part, the actual recorded voice of the modern woman he had married. This was not a secret, and that is what makes it strange. Scott did not deny it. He more or less acknowledged it, and he would go on acknowledging it for the rest of his career. The character of Gloria in The Beautiful and Damned was Zelda, openly and admittedly, down to phrases taken nearly word for word from things she had actually written. He used her diary as raw material the way a painter uses a model. And there is an account, hard to fully verify but persistent, that when a magazine editor expressed real interest in publishing Zelda's diaries on their own merits, Scott discouraged it. Not out of cruelty, out of necessity. He needed that material. It was, by then, part of his supply. You have to sit with what that arrangement actually was. Here was a woman whose writing was good enough to be published in a major novel, praised by critics, and absorbed into the legend of one of the most celebrated authors in America, and the writing was published. Just not under her name. The genius was visible to everyone. The author of it was invisible to almost everyone. And it did not stop with the diaries. Through the 1920s, Zelda wrote. She wrote essays and magazine pieces, and she wrote them well, with a style that was distinctly her own, brighter and stranger, and more impressionistic than her husband's polished prose. She wrote a piece called Eulogy on the Flapper, a kind of farewell to the very figure she had helped invent. She wrote sketches and articles. And here is where the arrangement turns from poetic into something colder and more practical. Magazines paid by the name. And Scott Fitzgerald's name, in those years, was worth a fortune. A piece signed by him could command thousands of dollars. The same piece signed by Zelda Fitzgerald might earn a fraction of that if it sold at all. So they made a business decision, the way couples make business decisions, quietly and without ceremony. Work that Zelda had written, or largely written, went out under his name. or under both their names, which in the eyes of editors and readers meant his name with hers attached as decoration. One story, Our Own Movie Queen, was published under Scott's name alone, though by his own private admission, Zelda had written most of it. You can read that two ways, and the honest thing is to read it both ways at once. On one hand, it was simply how they survived. They needed the money, his name made the money, and a marriage is a single economic unit. On the other hand, every time it happened, a small thing was confirmed and reinforced. That her words were valuable, that her name was not. That she could be the source of the work, but never the owner of it. The deeper you go into it, the harder it becomes to draw a clean line around whose talent was whose. They lived together, talked together, fed off each other constantly. He took her phrases. She shaped his characters by simply being herself in front of him. In the most literal sense, the literary empire that bore his name was built partly out of her. Her voice, her diaries, her wit, her way of seeing the world. And for a while, in the bright center of the 1920s, none of this looked like a wound. It looked like collaboration. It looked like a glamorous shared life, in which two extraordinary people poured everything into a single dazzling enterprise. The trouble with that arrangement is that it only feels like collaboration as long as one person never decides she wants her own name on the work. Zelda had not decided that yet. But she was beginning, somewhere underneath the parties and the applause, to feel the shape of the thing that had been taken. And what a person does with that feeling, once it finally arrives, is the rest of this story. They became famous for being themselves, which is a peculiar and exhausting way to be famous. Through the first half of the 1920s, Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald were not simply a successful novelist and his wife. They were the living illustration of the decade. The newspapers wrote about them the way they would later write about movie stars. What they wore, where they went, what they said. The two of them understood the assignment, and they performed it with a commitment that was, in its own way, a kind of art. The stories from those years have the quality of legend now, polished by 100 retellings. Zelda riding on the hood of a taxi down Fifth Avenue. The two of them jumping fully clothed into the fountain at Union Square, and again into the fountain at the plaza. Scott undressing at a performance of George White's Scandals. Zelda dancing on tables, the long parties that ran into mornings and then into other parties. They were charming, and they were drunk, and they were for a time the most enviable couple in America, the embodiment of everything the era promised about freedom and youth, and the refusal to grow old or careful. But you have to understand what that performance cost and who paid more of it. A legend has to be maintained. It does not maintain itself, and the work of being Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, the famous couple, was relentless. The drinking that had started as celebration settled into something heavier and more habitual, especially in Scott, whose relationship with alcohol would eventually become the central tragedy of his physical life. The money came in enormous bursts and went out faster, because the legend was expensive to keep. They were always slightly broke and always living slightly beyond it, which meant Scott always had to write the next story, take the next advance, keep the machine running. And the machine ran on their life, on parties that became material, on fights that became dialogue, on Zelda. In 1921, their daughter was born, Frances Scott Fitzgerald, called Scotty. Zelda's reported first words after the delivery, still groggy from the anesthesia, were that she hoped the baby would be a beautiful little fool. Scott liked the line so much that he gave it, almost exactly, to Daisy Buchanan in The Great Gatsby. It is one of the most famous things any character says in American literature. And it was something Zelda said, in a hospital, about her own child. The pattern from the early years had not changed. It had only become more seamless. Her life went in one end, and his fiction came out the other, and the better he got at it, the harder it became to see the seam. In 1924, they left for Europe, joining the great drift of American writers and artists to France, where the dollar was strong, and the living was cheap, and a person could drink openly without the inconvenience of prohibition. They settled on the Riviera, on that stretch of the Mediterranean coast that was in those years being quietly invented as a glamorous place by the people who could afford to summer there. And it was there that they fell into the orbit of Gerald and Sarah Murphy. The Murphys were wealthy, elegant, generous Americans who had made a kind of life out of beauty itself. They gathered around them the most interesting people of the age, and their villa became a salon, a center of gravity. Picasso came. Hemingway came. The Fitzgeralds came, and for a while they shone there as brightly as anyone. The Murphys would later be immortalized, in part, as the inspiration for the central couple in Tender is the Night, which is to say that even the friends became material eventually. Everything did. But the European years are also where the cracks first widened. In the summer of 1924, on the Riviera, Zelda became involved with a French naval aviator named Édouard Jozan. How far it went is one of those things history cannot settle, and the accounts differ. What is not in dispute is that something happened, that it shook the marriage badly, and that Scott folded it, of course, into his fiction. The episode became part of the emotional architecture of Tender is the Night. There is a story, again hard to confirm, that Zelda attempted to take her own life that summer with an overdose. The exact truth remains debated. The fact of the strain does not, and underneath all of it the quieter wound kept deepening. Because Zelda was now thoroughly cast in her role. She was the wife, the muse, the beautiful, brilliant, slightly mad woman whose function was to inspire the work and decorate the legend, and be perpetually the subject of someone else's sentences. The wit was still hers, the charm was still hers, but the life around her had been organized completely around his career. His writing was the work that mattered. Hers, when she did it, was a hobby, a flourish, a thing that earned a little money under his name when it earned anything at all. She was approaching 30. She had been famous for a decade, and somewhere in the noise of the parties and the glare of all that attention, a question had begun to form that she could not put down. Not what is wrong with the marriage. Something more dangerous than that. What, exactly, is mine? What in this entire dazzling enterprise belongs to me, and bears my name, and would exist if I were not simply the wife of the man who wrote it down? She did not yet have an answer. But she had decided to go looking for one, and the place she went looking was the strangest and most punishing place she could have chosen. In 1927, at the age of 27, Zelda Fitzgerald decided to become a professional ballerina, and almost everyone who has written about her since has treated that decision as the beginning of the end, the first clear sign that something inside her was coming loose. There is a case to be made for that reading. But it misses what was actually happening. And what was actually happening is the heart of this entire story. She had danced as a child in Montgomery. She had been good. And then she had stopped because she had married and become famous and spent 10 years being the subject rather than the maker. Now she was nearly 30, which in the world of classical ballet is not the beginning of a career but very nearly the end of one. The body is not supposed to be started that late. The training is meant to be carved into a person across childhood, year after year before the bones finish setting. Zelda knew all of this, and she decided to do it anyway. You have to understand the decision for what it was, underneath the strangeness of it. After a decade of being absorbed into someone else's work, she had chosen the one art form in the world that could not be borrowed, edited, co-signed, or published under another person's name. A novel can be ghostwritten. A diary can be lifted. A magazine piece can run under whichever name sells better. But a body on a stage is undeniable. Either you can do the thing or you cannot, and no one can do it for you, and no one can take the doing of it away. She had gone looking for something that would be hers alone, and she had found the most uncompromising answer to that question that exists. In Paris, she began studying under Lyubov Egorova, a former dancer of the Imperial Russian Ballet who now ran a respected studio. Egorova was serious, exacting, the real thing. And Zelda threw herself at the work with an intensity that frightened the people around her. She practiced for hours every day. She installed a mirror and a bar in their home and worked in front of it obsessively, sometimes to the sound of a single piece of music played over and over until the household could not bear it. She danced until her feet bled. She grew thin and hard and single-minded. The parties that had defined her stopped mattering. She wanted, with a hunger that had finally found a shape, to be good. Not charming, not beautiful. Good in a way that could be measured and that belonged to her. Scott was unsettled by it, and the honest thing is to say why. Part of it was concern. He could see the punishing edge of the discipline, the way it consumed her. But part of it was something less generous. And he was self-aware enough that it surfaces in his own letters and in the fiction he made from this period. Her ambition was a kind of reproach. As long as Zelda's creativity had flowed into him, into his books, into the shared legend, it had cost him nothing. Now she wanted something separate, something with her name on it. And a marriage built on the quiet arrangement that his work was, the work could not easily absorb a wife who had decided to become an artist in her own right. He called the ballet, dismissively, third-rate. Whether he believed that, or needed to believe, it is a question worth holding. And here is the part that breaks your heart, because it complicates the simple version of the story. She was good, not a prodigy, not destined for greatness. The late start had made that impossible. But she became a genuinely skilled dancer through sheer ferocity of will. Good enough that it was noticed. In 1929, an offer arrived from the San Carlo Opera Ballet Company in Naples. A real offer to a real company to dance solo roles. It was, by any measure, a remarkable thing for a woman who had begun training 2 years earlier in her late 20s. It was the door she had been hammering at. It was proof that the thing she wanted was not a fantasy, and she turned it down. The accounts of exactly why differ, and the truth is probably layered. The role was modest. The company was not the very top tier. She may have felt by then that it was beneath the standard she was punishing herself toward. There may have been pressure from the marriage, from a husband who did not want his wife disappearing into a ballet company in Italy. And there may already have been, underneath everything, the first stirrings of the illness that would soon take so much from her. But whatever the reason, the one concrete chance to make the dream real arrived, and she did not take it, and the dream did not survive the refusal intact. What it left behind was the thing she had been driving the dancing against in the first place, the exhaustion, the crushing, looping, self-punishing intensity that had no outlet now and nowhere to go. She kept dancing anyway, harder, longer, with less and less reason and less rest, as though if she could only practice enough, the door might open again. It would not. The body she had spent 2 years building toward this was breaking down. And the mind that had thrown itself so completely against the one thing she could call her own was, in 1930, about to come apart in a way that neither she nor Scott nor anyone around them had the language to understand. She had asked the question, "What in this life is mine?" The ballet had been her answer, and the answer was being taken from her too. In April of 1930, in Paris, Zelda Fitzgerald came apart. There is no gentler way to put it, and there is no precise way either, because the language we would use now did not exist then, and the language they used then was wrong. She was experiencing things that were not there. Hearing voices. Seized by anxieties she could not name or quiet. The relentless dancing had hollowed her out physically, and whatever had been building underneath it for years finally broke the surface. She was admitted to a clinic outside Paris, and then, when that did not help, she was moved to Switzerland, to a clinic called Prangens on the shore of Lake Geneva, one of the most respected institutions of its kind in the world. It was at Prangens that the word arrived that would define the rest of her life and most of what came after it. The doctors diagnosed her with schizophrenia. You have to be careful here, because this is the point where the story is most often told badly. For decades, the diagnosis was accepted as simple fact, and Zelda became, in the popular telling, the madwoman, the schizophrenic wife, the cautionary tale. But modern clinicians who have looked back at the records have raised serious and persistent doubts about whether that diagnosis was ever correct. The symptoms she actually showed, the cycles of frantic energy and crushing collapse, looked to many later observers far more like what we would now call bipolar disorder, or something else entirely, than like schizophrenia as it is understood today. The exact truth cannot be settled now, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What can be said is that she was given a label in 1930 by the science available in 1930, and that the label was almost certainly heavier and more final than what she was actually carrying. And the treatment matched the label. This was an era before any of the medications that might have genuinely helped her. The tools available were blunt and sometimes brutal: long confinements, enforced rest, restricted contact with the outside world, including, often, with her own daughter. And there is something worth sitting with in the particular shape of her treatment, because the doctors did not see her ambition as separate from her illness. They saw it as part of it. The dancing, the writing, the fierce drive to make something of her own, all of it was folded into the diagnosis, treated as symptom rather than as self. Part of what they set out to cure was the very thing that had been keeping her alive. It is here, too, that the marriage reveals itself most starkly, and the honest thing is to refuse the easy version in either direction. Because Scott was not a monster, and he was not a saint, and the truth lives in the uncomfortable space between. He paid for everything. The clinics were enormously expensive, and he wrote and wrote and wrote to cover the costs, churning out the magazine stories he had come to despise because they were what kept her cared for. By every account he was, in his way, devastated by what was happening to her, and frightened and trying. That much is real, and it should not be erased. But he was also, simultaneously, deeply invested in an understanding of the situation that served him. In the long consultations with her doctors, in his letters, in his own mind, Scott constructed a version of events in which he was the serious artist whose vital work was being threatened by his wife's instability, and in which Zelda's creative ambitions were not legitimate pursuits but expressions of her sickness. Her desire to write, to dance, to be something on her own, became evidence that she was unwell. He genuinely seems to have believed that there was only room in the family for one artist, and that his work, the work that paid the bills, the work the world had already validated, had the prior claim. The doctors, by and large, agreed with him. He was the famous one. He was the one paying. He was the one they listened to. So, picture the position she was actually in. She was a woman whose own gifts had been feeding someone else's career for over a decade. She had tried, finally, to claim something of her own, and the attempt had coincided with, and contributed to, a genuine collapse. And now she was inside an institution where the husband who had absorbed her talent and the doctors who answered to him had reached a quiet consensus that her ambition itself was the disease, that getting well meant, in part, giving up the very thing she had been reaching for. The trap had closed almost completely. There was barely a way to stand inside it that did not confirm someone else's story about her. And yet, and this is the thing that makes her remarkable rather than merely tragic, she did not stop. Even there, even inside the clinics, with time controlled and her contact restricted and her ambitions reframed as symptoms, she kept reaching for the work. She painted. She wrote letters of startling clarity and beauty. And she began, in stolen hours, to write something longer. Something of her own, drawn from her own life, in her own voice. She was assembling, quietly, inside the walls of a Swiss sanatorium, the one thing she would ever publish under her own name and no one else's. She did not know yet that finishing it would set off the bitterest fight of her marriage. She only knew that it was hers. And after everything, that was enough to keep going. By the start of 1932, Zelda was a patient at the Phipps Psychiatric Clinic at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. She was better than she had been, stable enough to work, and she was working at something with an intensity that should sound familiar by now. In a span of roughly 6 weeks, writing in concentrated bursts, she produced an entire novel. She called it Save Me the Waltz. And then she did something that, in the context of that marriage, was almost an act of war. She mailed it directly to Maxwell Perkins, Scott's editor at Scribner's, the man who handled her husband's career. She sent it without showing it to Scott first. You have to understand why that small administrative fact landed like a detonation. For more than 10 years, the arrangement had held. His life was the work. Her life was the material. And now she had taken the material, which is to say their shared life, and written it into a book of her own, in her own voice, and sent it to his publisher behind his back. She had stopped being the source. She had become the author. And she had done it using the one supply of raw material that Scott had always considered his, because here is the collision at the center of it. Scott was, at that very moment, years into writing his own novel about their marriage, about a brilliant man and the unstable wife he loves, about psychiatry and the Riviera and the slow ruin of a golden couple. It would eventually become Tender is the Night. He had been laboring over it for years, blocked and frustrated and drinking, and he regarded the autobiographical material of their life together as his subject, his territory. And Zelda, in 6 weeks in a psychiatric clinic, had just written a novel out of the same marriage, the same breakdown, the same ballet, the same Riviera summer. She had gotten there first. His reaction was fury, and it was not quiet. He read the manuscript, and he was, by his own account and everyone else's, enraged. He felt she had stolen his material, which is a remarkable thing to feel about the events of your own shared life, but he felt it sincerely. He accused her of plagiarizing him, of using the very experiences he intended for his own book. Sit with the symmetry of that for a moment. The man who had built a career partly out of her diaries, and her letters and her words, who had lifted her sentences and published them under his own name, now accused his wife of theft for writing about her own life. He genuinely could not see that the material had ever been anything other than his. And then he did the thing that tells you everything about the balance of power in that marriage. He did not block the book. He revised it. With Perkins largely deferring to him, Scott went through Zelda's manuscript and required changes. He insisted that certain passages, the ones that overlapped too closely with the novel he was still writing, be cut or altered. He had her change the name of the autobiographical hero because she had originally named the character after a name Scott was reserving for his own. The portrait of the husband in her novel, a painter rather than a writer but unmistakably him, was softened. He edited his wife's account of their marriage to protect his own forthcoming account of their marriage. She wanted her version told. He made sure it would not damage his. Save Me the Waltz was published in October of 1932, and it failed. The reviews were unkind, often condescending, and the book sold barely more than 1,000 copies. Zelda earned almost nothing from it. Some of the failure was the writing itself, which is uneven, the work of someone who had never been allowed to develop the craft, written at tremendous speed under enormous strain. But some of it was the book she had been forced to publish, rather than the one she had written, weakened by the cuts, by the rush, by the fact that the one person who might have helped her shape it was the same person determined to keep it from outshining his own. And yet, you have to actually read it to understand what was lost, and people did eventually read it. Decades later, the prose is strange and original and alive in places where Scott's is merely polished. The voice is unmistakably hers, the same bright, leaping, image-drunk voice that had been bleeding into his books for a decade. It is the work of someone with real, untrained, undeniable talent, who had been given 6 weeks and a clinic and a husband standing over the manuscript with a blue pencil, and who made something anyway. It is the only novel she ever published. It is the closest thing that exists to Zelda Fitzgerald speaking entirely in her own name, and for most of a century, almost no one read it. Tender is the Night came out 2 years later, in 1934. It is a great novel, one of the finest of its era, and it is built, openly and without apology, out of the same marriage Zelda had tried to claim. The man got the masterpiece and the legacy. The woman got the failure and the silence. And the cruelest part, the part that is almost too neat to bear, is that both books were quarried from the same life. They had lived one marriage. He was allowed to own it. She was not. She would never publish another. The fight had cost her the last clear chance at a name of her own. What remained was the slow closing of the years, and a fire still 16 years away that no one in that clinic could have imagined. The last 16 years of Zelda Fitzgerald's life are the hardest to tell, because they are not really a story so much as a long, slow tide going out. After Save Me the Waltz, the brilliant, terrible momentum of her life simply slowed. She moved between clinics and periods at home, never well for long, never fully gone either. The marriage that had defined and consumed her quietly stopped being a marriage in any daily sense. By the mid-1930s, Scott had gone to Hollywood to write for the movies and to chase the money that the clinics and the drinking and the collapsing legend kept demanding. He took up with another woman, the columnist Shayla Graham, and built a separate life on the far coast. He and Zelda were never divorced. They simply became two people who had once been the most famous couple in America and now wrote each other letters across a continent. And the letters are the thing that complicates any simple verdict on what they were to each other. Because they are tender. Even at the end, even after everything, there is a real and aching affection in them, a shared language that no one else could speak, two people who had wrecked each other and could not quite let go. He kept paying for her care. She kept asking after his work. Whatever else it had been, the bond did not break. It just had nowhere left to live. In December of 1940, Scott Fitzgerald died of a heart attack in Hollywood. He was 44 years old. His last novel, about a Hollywood producer, was unfinished on his desk. He died believing himself a failure, his books out of print, the legend that had made him faded into something almost embarrassing, a relic of a decade everyone now wanted to forget. He did not live to see himself become one of the most important writers in the American canon. That came later, and he never knew. Zelda outlived him by more than 7 years. She spent much of that time back in Montgomery, in the South she had come from, living quietly with her mother in the small, ordinary world that had produced her. She painted. She wrote, though she never finished another book. She turned toward religion with the same intensity she had once turned toward dancing. She was, by the accounts of those who saw her in those years, often calm, often kind, a faded woman in a faded town, a long way from the girl on the hood of the taxi. When the illness rose again, she would return to the place that had become her other home. Highland Hospital, in Asheville, North Carolina, in the mountains, where she went when she could not manage on her own. On the night of the 10th of March, 1948, a fire broke out in the main building of Highland Hospital. It started in the kitchen and climbed the building through a dumbwaiter shaft, spreading upward floor by floor in the dark. The fire escapes had been chained. The windows on the upper floors were not built to open fully. Zelda was on the top floor, in a locked room, awaiting electroshock treatment scheduled for the following morning. She and 8 other women died in the fire. She was identified afterward only by a charred slipper beneath her body. She was 47 years old. She was buried beside Scott, eventually in Maryland, and for a long time that was the end of it. The wife of a great writer, a beautiful, tragic, troubled woman, a footnote to his genius, the cautionary tale at the edge of someone else's biography. That was the version that held. That was the version almost everyone believed. And then, slowly, the story turned over. In 1970, a writer named Nancy Milford published a biography called simply Zelda. It treated her not as a footnote but as a subject, a whole person with her own gifts and her own ruin, and it became a sensation. People read Save Me the Waltz for the first time in decades and found, to their surprise, a real and original voice inside it. Her paintings were exhibited. Her writing was collected. A generation that had begun asking new questions about the women standing just outside the frame of every famous man's life looked at Zelda and saw, suddenly, not a madwoman but a woman who had been talented and ambitious in a time and a marriage that had no room for both of those things in a wife. The reappraisal can go too far in the other direction, and the honest thing is to say so. She was not a suppressed master, robbed of certain greatness. Her one novel is flawed. Her talent was real but largely untrained, never given the years it needed to become whatever it might have become. To turn her into a pure victim, or Scott into a pure villain, is to do to her in reverse what was done to her in life. To flatten a complicated person into a useful symbol. Life is not that tidy, and people are not that simple. They were two enormously gifted, enormously damaged people who loved each other and fed on each other, and could not, in the end, both survive the same marriage intact. But here is what is true, and what is worth carrying out of all of this. There was a line in a celebrated American novel about a beautiful little fool that a young woman said first in a hospital about her own daughter. There were diaries and letters, and a voice that ended up inside books that bore another name. There was a real gift in a real person who spent her life as the material for someone else's work and got 6 weeks and a locked clinic to make something of her own. The empire had her name nowhere on it, but it was built, in part, out of her. And for 100 years, almost no one knew, now perhaps you do,